Lesson 8, Influences on American Government, Part 2 of our European heritage. We left off Lesson 7 with English common law. Let's pick up now with European absolutism that was prevalent in the 1600s, so the 17th century throughout Europe. While Britain was limiting their governing authority, limiting their monarchs, making Parliament supreme through the Glorious or Bloodless Revolution in 1689, on the European continent, absolutism was the prominent governing theory. Absolutism. On the continent, in France, Louis XIV, he probably best embodied the greatest period of absolutism. Louis XIV had the longest reign in Western civilization. I believe he ruled for 72 years in France. He was known as the Grand Monarch or the Sun King. And he once uttered, "I am the state." In other words, Louis XIV claiming that he was France. Absolutism. An absolute monarch. Most absolute monarchs believed that they received their power to govern from God, that God had granted them the authority, the power to rule. We call this theory divine right. It's very similar to what the Chinese had many centuries ago, known as the mandate of heaven. Rulers would claim the mandate of heaven, the right to rule from the gods. This is the European version of mandate of heaven, divine right, that God had granted or given the king, the monarch, the queen, the power to rule. Others, like Thomas Hobbes in his very famous book, Leviathan, he also believed in absolutism. He defended absolutism as a legitimate form of government. For Thomas Hobbes, the objective was to avoid the state of nature. What is that, according to Hobbes? In the state of nature, man would exist in his natural state, without government, without society in which to live. What would life be like in the state of nature, without government, without society? Hobbes' very famous description in the state of nature: life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, in short. This is to be avoided at all costs. Solitary, of course, meaning lonely, by yourself, poor, nasty, terrible, awful, brutish, and brutal. Think of the word brutal. In short, to avoid this condition, a strong absolutist government is needed. This was Hobbes' views and his theories on why the government needed ultimate authority, ultimate power in society. So Hobbes defended absolutism not on a religious basis, but he provided the first rational defense of absolutism, a secular defense. A secular defense of absolutism, a non-religious defense of absolutism. Okay, so what is life like in an absolutist society for the government? with an absolute ruler, number one, he or she has unlimited authority. Unlimited. Unlimited. Two, is not checked by anyone. Has no restrictions or checks on his authority, his power. Three, the people in an absolutist society are viewed as subjects to the monarch, having no rights, a mere subject, with whom the monarch can do as he or she please. In this view, the monarch is above the law. It's not limited by law, not restricted by law. The law does not apply to the governing absolutist ruler. The monarch is above the law. Well, the Enlightenment is going to bring in a new theory of governing that's going to challenge divine right and absolutism. First, what was the Enlightenment? You may recall from your study of world history, it was an 18th century or 1700 intellectual movement in which the leading thinkers challenged the existing institutions of society by applying the critical test of reason and rational thought. The Enlightenment was part of the great age of reason that followed the scientific revolution in Europe. If you remember your world and European history. The leading thinkers or writers during this period, the intellectuals, they began to challenge absolutism and divine right as being inconsistent with reason and rational thought. These writers were called philosophes. Most of them were French. They would gather in salons or coffee houses and discuss and debate their ideas, their philosophies, their new ways of thinking. Many of their beliefs were controversial. They went against the existing dogmas of the day. With respect to government, the philosophers thought that rulers did not receive their power from God or a divine being, but from the people, the people's will, the people's consent. We've talked about this concept in an earlier lesson, the idea of popular sovereignty, the power to govern rests with the people. The people empower the governing authority. The government exists to serve the people, not the people to serve the government. Popular sovereignty. The philosophers also thought that the people have the right to revolt against an unjust or tyrannical government. This concept of the right to revolt is called popular revolution. Of course, the big French Revolution in the 1780s put many of these ideas into practice. The French Revolution was a mass revolt, a revolt of the masses against the ruling class, against the first and the second estates, the third estate, the masses of French people. Again, you may recollect this from your study of world history. And then a new idea of government emerged amongst the philosophers called the contract theory. The contract theory of government. In the contract theory of government, people are not subjects to a monarch, an absolute monarch. People are citizens who have unalienable rights rights that cannot be taken away. The people and the government enter into a contract, not a literal one. The people willingly empower the government. In return from the government, the people receive protection of their natural rights. What are these rights? John Locke wrote them as life, liberty, and property in his 2 treatises on government. Thomas Jefferson wrote them as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, of course, from the Declaration of Independence. And the French, in their French Revolution, in their very famous document, the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, wrote natural rights as the rights to liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. These are natural rights, unalienable rights that we have as humans. Natural right theory. This also was referenced in an earlier lesson. Other Enlightenment ideas: to prevent abuse of power by government. The philosophers believed that government should be separated into 3 branches: an executive branch, a judicial branch, a legislative branch. Separation of powers into 3 branches. And also that these 3 branches should have the power to check and balance the other branches of government. This is to prevent one branch from becoming too powerful. Again, the purpose of separation of powers and checks and balances is to limit the authority of government, to prevent abuse of government. Our founding fathers were very familiar with the works of these philosophers. Many read their works. So who were they? John Locke, mentioned earlier, who wrote 2 treatises on government. He wrote about our natural right theory and popular revolution. Thomas Jefferson wrote many of Locke's ideas in our own Declaration, as we will see later. Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote The Social Contract, the concepts of popular sovereignty and popular revolution, the general will of the people, empower the government. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And then Baron de Montesquieu wrote Spirit of the Laws, that government should be divided into 3 branches for a separation of powers, and each of these branches should be able to limit or restrict the powers of the others. Checks and balances. Montesquieu, Spirit of the Laws. This concludes Lesson 8, Part 2 of our European influences on our system of government.